Welcome to Physicians Who Lead, the podcast where we sit down with physician leaders who are shaping the future of healthcare. Each episode, we dive into the real challenges facing our system today and hear directly from the physicians leading the way with innovation, resilience, and vision. If you want to understand how healthcare is changing and meet the leaders driving that change, you're in the right place.
Welcome to the Physicians Who Lead podcast, where we talk to physicians that are shaping healthcare through leadership, service, and advocacy. I'm Kevin Kirkpatrick, and today I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Sharon Ball. Is it
Good
Ball,
morning.
eh?
Good morning, Kevin.
Morning. So Dr. Ball is a community-based comprehensive family physician in Cambridge. She is the lead physician for the Delta Coronation Family Health Organization, an assistant clinical professor and electives chair with the Michael G. DeGroote School of Medicine at McMaster University, and currently serves as the board chair for the Ontario Medical Association. She has been widely recognized for her work in health equity, physician advocacy, and system leadership. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We've kind of circled each other through LinkedIn for a while, so it's nice to finally have some time to chat. So to get us started, I'd like to ask a question I ask a lot of leaders in healthcare, but when you look back at your career, what was the moment you realized you weren't just practicing medicine, but you were being called into leadership?
I think there really wasn't an aha moment for me. I think for me, it was really, Kevin, about seeing things that didn't make sense, opportunities to make a difference, often stepping into problems where there wasn't an obvious owner. So I think back actually to just a small little problem where we had a psychiatry form as a family physician. We would make referrals into psychiatry, and it was a 7-page form. And we had a bunch of family physicians kind of sitting around saying how clunky that form was and how problematic it was. And there were check boxes, has this person set fires, just loads and loads of check boxes. And I remember one day just feeling so exasperated. So I walked over 2 doors down to the hospital and talked to my chief of psychiatry, no title. I was a community family physician. And I said, there's got to be a better way. Do you actually even read this form? And she said, you know what? I just look at the paragraph where you describe the issue, to be honest. And I said, well, if I promise to write if the person's an arsonist, and I promise that it's a good quality sort of paragraph, can we get rid of this form? And we reduced it to a page. And it's a small little thing, but it's the idea of we didn't really have to make it more complicated than it was. It required some relation and a little bit of understanding of perspectives, and we were able to change it within a couple of days to, some relief by doctors.
And even though it may be considered a small thing, is if it's 10 minutes 6 times a day
That's
or
right.
6 times a week, then it starts adding up, right? And I think that's
Really.
sometimes where we look at change and stuff like that, right? So you've built a career that spans clinical care, medical education, advocacy, and leadership. A lot of times, and I think you just alluded to this, but a lot of times leadership doesn't begin with a title. It begins with a problem and deciding to step into it. What drew you into the broader leadership beyond that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that as a family physician, I would say especially you just see all touch points of the system. So you hear from your patients very directly what they're experiencing. In my situation, although I'm the lead physician of a family health organization, it's really just 6 doctors and we have 6 medical office assistants and 1 part-time registered practical nurse. So my point is that the problems were very close to me. I didn't really have a lot of other team members hearing the issues. And I suspect that's part of it, getting a glimpse at all parts of the health system as consults come in and hearing from the patient about all their different pain points. And so that kind of led to a lot of my style, which is fairly pragmatic. And that's sort of how I approach leadership for the most part. I think that I see an issue and I say, well, how can I make a bit of a difference? And so that led to roles at the LIN and Ontario Health and at the Ontario Health Team. And even with women physicians, I remember hearing from a surgeon that she was getting different types of consult requests from women. This was on a women's WhatsApp group. She said, I'm getting really complex ones. I'm not getting as many procedures. And I remember many of us took a step back and said, wow, that's probably true. And so as I started learning more about the gender pay gap, that's actually how I got involved with the OMA in the first place. And that's led to a board position with the Federation of Medical Women of Canada, and really just some great work that we're trying to highlight at the OMA around the gender pay gap, and actually having women physicians step into a new governance structure where they can actually speak to negotiations directly. So I feel like it's this incidental sort of being in the right place at the right time, but not focusing always on the problems, but is there an opportunity for some solution, right? And so lots of relationship work there, and hope, I would say, for the most part.
It's funny that you say that because I did a podcast episode of an older podcast that I had with a Dr. Leslie Barron.
Yes.
And you mean
Yes.
we had that conversation about the gender pay gap, right?
That's right.
And it was funny to me because I was so clueless. Like I thought it's fee for service. Like, what are you talking about, right? But then it was interesting how the human behaviors and human aspect of who got referred to who completely affects that, right? So it was quite interesting.
And she's a leader in that space, so I would love to watch that if there was a
Yeah,
pod on it, yeah. Big fan.
I closed that podcast down years ago because I took a contract with an organization and they didn't want me to have a podcast. They felt it conflicted with that contract. But it was interesting because it was probably the most watched episode because even Andre Picard from the Globe and Mail shared it on his X account. So I
Wow.
thought
Yeah, there you
I
go.
was so excited. I think I actually have a screenshot of it. You've been heavily involved in primary care. Um, Has that changed your perspective on leadership over the years, given the environment of primary care?
Yeah, I think it has. I mean, there's a lot of resource scarcity and a lot of bumps in our system, and a lot of things that you have to look at from a very values-based, all leadership is values-based perspective. And what's advanced my leadership is not sort of dwelling only in the problem, which is hard not to do when you're so busy and you're so taxed, but sort of lifting back up out of that. So, for example, I might feel, right, as a family physician, that, wow, there's a lot of, because there's such long times to get in to see, let's say, a specialist colleague. When they are seen by a specialist, some of the work that normally would be carried by a specialist, for some time, some follow ups now seems to be coming back to me. My first response to that sort of feels very frustrating in some ways. That, wow, this is a lot of stuff that's coming back to me for follow up. But then I remember speaking to a specialist and saying, I'm really feeling like this in family medicine. It takes a very long time to get in, and then many things that would normally be carried are coming back. And they said, well, on the other hand, Sharon, what we see is a lot of frustration about wait lists. We're told that, we want people in sooner, family physicians need people in sooner. So we're load balancing what absolutely needs to be done by us versus what might be able to be followed up by the family doctor with support. And I thought that's a really interesting perspective. And Kevin, the more conversations I have, not about people or about parts of the system, but with people and with the system, I actually find that that leads to a lot of shared values grounding again, and a lot of really practical solutions. Some of them are small, some of them are larger and scalable depending on, where the conversations are happening. But I would say being a family physician, it's a very much about a relational thing, and a very much about longitudinal relationships. And so longitudinal relationships require trust, they require circling back, and they require really like a state of advocacy and inquiry. I think that's true for all physicians, but I think as a family physician, in particular, you're sort of able to see what works in one part of the system and maybe what doesn't work in another, and so you can take some of that knowledge and start having some really generative discussions with people.
And it's interesting because I often find that communication within the medical community is necessary for any sort of change and any sort of understanding, right? Is I did some work with the community to recruit family physicians, and I had relationships with the hospital as well. So when you talk to a physician, you would talk to them about the different options within the community, but also within the hospital. And then I would do events and I would invite the hospital physicians as well, right? Conceptually, like if you look at some small communities that have really good communication, it's because they're in similar spots. They're going to run into each other at the hockey rink, or they're going to run into each other at Tim Hortons or at the theater, and that makes it easier to communicate, right? As we get into larger centers, it's so much harder because you can't just walk down the street, right? Like, and I think that's definitely something that, you have to kind of build a system and a structure into. So committee
Right.
work and things like that are definitely important. But you, what I've heard about you in the market and the system is that you're an advocate for health equity in vulnerable populations and looking at partnerships across the system, which you just mentioned. When you think about advocacy as a physician leader, how do you put it into practice?
I think it's that can be kind of challenging, sort of how to shift from so advocacy can be about problem identification, amplifying the problem, bringing eyes to the problem. That's an important type of advocacy. Another type of advocacy is thinking about sort of, as we mentioned, the players and the stakeholders, right? Because usually, in addition, sort of to identifying the problem, the next step is, well, which stakeholders have the right levers to address the problem, whether that's government levers and legislation. I'm thinking back to the pandemic, or whether it's actually something very local. And so the way I think about it is I do a lot of stakeholder mapping in my head, like who actually could make a difference. And then second, how do I actually get in front of them? And the third thing is, how do we values align? So I feel like with any sort of advocacy, a lot of it is about that. Well, are we grounded in a basic principle? Let's say if it's about health equity, are we grounded in the idea of equitable access? I mean, generally we are, right? Are we grounded in the idea that we're not really where we need to be, either because we don't have enough data, in the case of race-based data, or because people are telling us, or we're experiencing on the ground that there's this issue? And I think when you kind of align the values, you'll find that you're actually not that far apart, right? And then you can start. And I think what happens is you have to come in without a lot of preconceived notions when you're doing advocacy work. You have to, at your heart, believe that the people who are across the table from you care about the issue. They just have a different perspective. So I think with any solutioning, to be honest, with any leadership, a lot of it really is about aligning, making values based decisions and aligning on what's in the art of the possible. And to be honest, when we do that, we open up a bit of a generative space, right, Kevin? So what I might think is a solution might actually not be the solution, but it doesn't matter because we agree on the problem. So we'll figure out the solution together. So that's sort of how I approach advocacy, I would say, for the most part.
Yeah, and I think that approach helps because it's not necessarily an approach based on blame, right? And I think that we
Absolutely.
often, as a government funded or government led healthcare system, like it becomes very pragmatically clinicians versus the administration. And then the problem is both sides are needed. So, if you're throwing arrows over this perceived gap, it doesn't work well together. Right. I saw a Facebook post this morning of somebody whose wife's a nurse and complaining that the CEO got a raise
Mm.
and that they gave the nurses free garlic bread. Right. And it's like, this lack of understanding of, there's one CEO, right? And they have a certain responsibility and should be paid accordingly. You have, but nurses who everybody should always be paid more, but that's not the world we live in or the system we live in. Right. So, this notion of, if you're not seeing the patient, you're not needed. Right. So it's an interesting thing to balance advocacy with an understanding. Right. So this question is, it's an interesting one, and it's, we alluded to it earlier, but for women physicians who are stepping into leadership and still kind of wonder if they belong in that space, what would you want them to hear from you?
Oh, goodness. Absolutely, they belong. So first of all, women aren't a part of Ontario healthcare system. They are Ontario's healthcare system, whether you're talking about nurses or physicians, like just to go back to your last example. Not only that, we are actually the patients. I mean, most of the entry into the system is actually by women, not just for their own care, Kevin, right? They bring the children largely. I'm talking about largely. And sometimes they actually bring their family members. They're often more proportionately, they are the family members who are bringing in older parents, for example, sometimes even parents-in-law, even pushing sometimes their partners. to say, there's value in preventative health care here. So on that side, you can imagine how important it is to have women physicians, women who actually reflect the communities that they serve, it not only in the clinics and in the hospitals, but in leadership as well. So for women, I would say you belong. And the important part for us as women physicians who are getting more advanced positions, it's actually to make sure we sponsor and we partner and we champion and we coach, that those are safe leadership environments, that we highlight some of the successes so that people see themselves in leadership. Dr. Zainab Abdurrahman was just our last OMA president, and historically, she passed on the presidency to Dr. Rebecca Hicks at our annual general meeting last week. That's the first time we've had a physician, a woman OMA president, pass off to another OMA women president. A first time in over 140 years. Same thing with the board chair, interestingly enough. Dr. Kathy Folds is a board chair who's a woman physician who passed off to me. And so there's so much stuff, and this is just a small example. There's much, much broader examples across the health system. There's still work to do, but we need to show that it's possible, and not only possible, it's happening right
Mhm.
around us. I think we need to highlight that more. That's the beauty of your question on this podcast. If just one person hears the story and it lifts them to know that, this is happening around them and it's their moment and it's their time and we're in a different world, I think that there's so much value in that. And I appreciate the question.
And I think that there are a lot of supports in place now that didn't that may not have existed 10, 15 years ago, right? Like Dr. Gautam in Ottawa has a community called the Raft that
Yes.
is predominantly supporting women physicians. A colleague of mine that I use for coaching when I place physician leaders, because I include coaching in all my placements, Dr. Kristen Woods, she has a podcast for women in leadership as well, right? So I think we're generating the system and the people like yourself that are leading and putting a hand out to lift the people that follow them. And physicians were always interesting is that when you talk to a physician, they usually know the residents the year ahead and the year behind them, right? Innately, because you're all in the trenches getting to become a physician and it builds that camaraderie. So I think that's great. Now, this is a tough one because the OMA is under criticism in some areas and then obviously it has a huge necessity. What role do you believe the OMA can play in helping physicians beyond just advocating for them and that can help lead the change?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, physician leadership and developing physician leadership is a core part of our mandate. And so we want Ontario's physicians to be the trusted voice of healthcare, without a doubt. And so, how do we invest in that? Well, it's just a lot of people don't know, but we actually have 600 physicians who do work on behalf of the OMA formally. We have something called the Physician Leadership Program, where we really look to support leadership development, not just in the OMA. Any physician can apply, but really across the entire healthcare system, Kevin, like at Ontario Health Teams, in the hospitals, in academia, to learn and to educate them around governance, around developing a community of practice of like minded leaders. There's actually pieces that we put out on our website that are accessible to all members, almost 50,000, which actually have modules, like little mini credentialing sort of modules to teach on those things. Leadership is something we're all leaders. By definition, we lead our teams, we lead decision making. That competency is actually something that all physicians have. But as they step into other spaces and places, we want to make sure that they're armed with those tools. And the amount of interest that physicians have in actually getting more formalized training is actually energizing. We're going into a meeting next in a couple of weeks called the Physician Leadership Group with our General Assembly, and the amount of thought leadership just in that group and their connections out to their districts and to their sections is heartening. And that's the pulse of the Ontario Medical Association. It's just very exciting, even coming into this new role, that we have such a wonderful group of doctors who are ready to advance change.
Yeah. It's interesting because I started this podcast a little over a year ago and it was kind of there's a Dr. Deborah Boyce who she kind of she kind of spurned me on with or with this process, right? So, I mean, like I had a chief of staff start last month, and they started their coaching this week, right? So I include in my recruitment fee 5 or 6 months of coaching, right? And it's done to support the transition, support the onboarding, and support that individual so that my clients are getting the best possible, the best possible person and the best possible placement, right? It also allows us to support internal candidates that want to progress, as well as transitioning for the external candidates. And she, Dr. Boss, was, and I were talking, and she was, talking about, how difficult it is to transition into leadership, and how that there's more support needed. And I think that led me to the podcast, that led me to to changing my whole placement structure. And I think this is where organizations like the OMA are starting to do some good things too, about investing in the physicians, and investing in them, because I mean it's a pet peeve for me, and I've worked internally for 3 hospitals, and there's always kind of a chasm between the physicians and the hospitals. And I think a lot of it came down to mischaracterizing the relationship, because physicians are autonomous, right? And they're, paid through OHIP. So therefore they're not employees, right? And I think that that's a trap, right? Is because, we don't believe that we invest the same amount in them. And even if you look at physician leadership roles, they can range from a point 0.2 FT, 0.25 FTE to a point 0.6 FTE. Hospitals and clinics and stuff run 24/7, right? So it's it's different, right?
Yeah, no, there's a lot of silent leadership as well. There's a lot of physicians who are holding systems together through actually relationships.
Yeah.
And that piece cannot always be captured in those traditional job descriptions, right? There's this false line sometimes between the clinical work we do and the administrative leadership. They're very
Yeah.
intertwined.
Yeah. Well, I think about people like Dr. Ken Milne, who's like an
Yeah,
emerge physician who works in, like, I don't know, maybe 50 hospitals, it seems like.
it does seem like it.
He's constantly holding things together, and at the same time, publishing a ton of content about quality and things around emergency medicine, right? So there's been a lot of he's done a lot of work, and and there's such a mission driven aspect to it. And I think that's the thing that I often wonder if isn't been taken for granted, is that physicians and nurses and clinicians are predominantly mission driven, right?
Yes.
If you got into medicine for money, then you're probably not going to be happy and last very long. So, there's a lot of mission driven stuff where, I'll just take on an extra shift, or I'll take on an extra patient. And I think we are hitting the point now with a workload that we need to start looking at systems and changing it so that we're taking care of people. If you look
We've
at
blocked
the
off.
last placements I've made over the last year, they've all been in places where the culture was good, right? And the culture will drive it and stuff like that, right? So sorry, I got on a tangent as always, but what are the habits or mindsets that mattered to you the most in your leadership journey?
Well, that's an interesting question. Habits and mindsets. I think active listening, I mean, it sounds a little bit corny. I remember years and years ago, somebody said that, and I thought, what does that mean? But actually, I think active listening is important. Like true engagement is important because when you come in very closed in leadership, like this is what I want out of this meeting, this is what I want. What happens is you miss an opportunity to actually see the art of the possible. And so, if you're trying to get from A to B, I think that what you'll realize is a lot of people are actually trying to get to a very similar place, just
Hmm.
starting from a different lens. And so actively listening for cues about what's important to that person, how to, again, go back to values aligning. Perhaps somebody, let's say if I'm in a cross sectoral meeting. I was thinking about a meeting that I had around that I was chairing around ALC, the ultra level care, basically just getting people to go to the appropriate place, the best care place for them for their level of care. And so that was a little bit around long term care homes or traditional transitional care units. And I remember, Kevin, the approach was so different in terms of how I thought about that. and I was chairing, but what I would have brought to that which would have been community resources, connections with family medicine, connections with, now they call it Ontario Health at Home, like those supports to keep them out of the hospital. And of course, when I was listening to the hospital leadership, it was really about how do we facilitate those transfers. So we were trying to, in some ways, solve the same problem, which is that this is not the best place for the patient. And this is not the
Mhm.
best place from a system point of view for them to be, but the angles were different. And so we also looked at the structures that we have, which were a little acute care focused, the metrics that we had, which really focused on the start of the journey being in the hospital and the movement out there. But really, the larger conversation was kind of frustrating for some of the community members. And so, what we talked about is sort of the deliverables that we had with respect to metrics, but the art of the possible. How do we expand the conversation? How do we expand the timeline and when the time begins, which is really when that family physician in the community is starting to notice that somebody's not doing as well at home. They hear that from their family members. They're making themselves more referrals for some community supports, and there's a lot of inequity in that too. Isn't that signal a part of the system? And wouldn't actually resource investment there actually solve our problem downstream? So yes, right now the boat is flooding and we're bailing out water from it, but really, what is the solution to actually make sure that boat is structurally sound in the beginning? And so I think, yeah, active listening, not being so fixed that perhaps today and in this exact group, that problem is not going to be solved. But as we build relationships, as we talk about sort of zooming in and out, we can keep this longitudinal relationship going. And I think that served me really well in a lot of the leadership that I've done around problem solving.
Yeah. And it's interesting because you're right. Like, my father is in long-term care. Sorry, my mother's in long-term care in Ottawa. My father's in a hospital in Briere doing active rehab, and
Right.
I mean he might be going to long-term care as well. And, and it's interesting because the pathway to get them in long-term care is expedited because he's in the hospital, and my mother was in the hospital, right? Whereas had they stayed in the community, it's a much harder, longer process, right? So you're right, like it's addressing that process of how to get there as opposed to where you're coming from is done. But we all know that there's a financial aspect of getting them out of the hospital that will put a microscope on that, right? So you know it's a challenge. Now, I have a question on the flip side of the last question. What things have you had to unlearn to become a stronger leader?
Oh my goodness. Premature closure. We use that term a lot in medicine. You come in and you've decided this is what the person has, or you're fairly certain that this is what's going on and you don't have that broad differential diagnosis, right? And it has impacted all of us. To give a clinical story, because you can never get a doctor in front of you without talking about a patient story. So here's mine. I remember I had a woman who was in her early and she came in about 3 or 4 times over 2 or 3 weeks, like really dense fatigue. She was so tired. And I remember talking to her and she had some stress going on. She had other sorts of things with relation to menstruation historically and she was a vegetarian. So we were like, "Oh, let's think about all the things that this could be." We went over a medication list. I ordered some blood work and checked her thyroid and just because there was so much going on, and it was quite an impressive change. Well, Kevin, wouldn't you know, she ended up being pregnant. And it was one of those things where I didn't think about that specifically. I was so leaned into her history of iron deficiency anemia and her own thought about hypothyroidism that I didn't take a normal what I would normally do, which is to take a step back, ask her how her life is going. She's a woman of childbearing age, like all the stuff that I know to do, but I was so zoomed in. And I think that, and I mean, it's just a small anecdote. It happens to all of us. We definitely discovered it very quickly. But my point is that premature closure leads to some problems. And so that's the main thing I would say I've tried to unlearn. Obviously, as a clinician, you get better at it. But in terms of leadership, to not come in thinking that the people across from the table don't have their own issues, perhaps have their own guardrails, maybe have a timeline that's different from yours. Ultimately, sort of look at them and say, well, your angle, like going back to the ALC, yes, is to move people along. I understand the metrics, but really it's hard. There's a lot of different reasons. One about resource allocation for sure. Is it the best place? And there's a lot of evidence that it isn't, even from a best care practice point of view, like nosocomial infections and stuff like that. But of course, I have to believe that they went into medicine, whether they're an administrator, or they're a clinician, or they're a physician, because they care about patients. And at the heart of it, when you start talking about the values, some of them will actually really show a great amount of vulnerability that I wish this wasn't the case, or they'll do what you did. Give an example of how they know how this feels, not just from a hospital administrator point of view, but as a child or as a sibling. Your story, my mother right now is also in Oakville in the hospital getting rehabbed after a very long ICU stay. And so sometimes that connectedness makes us take a step back and say, okay, what is our problem? Let's try to unlearn the fact that I'm coming in with a family physician hat or a community hat or whatever hat I'm wearing. We're actually people who care about the patients in this situation, and with that lens, as I've learned to really take that step back and look for values alignment, it's created so much relational potential. And when you have that relationship, man, does it ever come in handy? Because even if you're not the right person, you can connect people to others with a little bit of credibility, right? I was thinking about the doctors you've been talking about, Dr. Gautam. I was part of the raft. I joined that. I found it very helpful. Dr. Milne, I'm a huge fan of his content. Dr. Boyce and Dr. Barron and her work. Those are often relational things. Like as leaders get to know each other and know each other's style, we started developing this really huge virtual sort of Rolodex. And I would say
Mhm.
through my example, that kind of extends to system administrators as well, other clinicians, lots of specialist colleagues who do great work. So I don't have a big division for me between hospital and community. Like I really try to look at things from a systems lens. And what I've unlearned has allowed me to be a system thinker, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, and if it makes you feel any better, like this is something I fight all the time, right? Is as a recruiting consultant, like an executive search consultant, I mean, I get so excited to try and fix the problem that sometimes I jump in with both feet, and I'm having to teach myself to pause for cause, I call
Yes.
it, and listen more instead of trying to fix it, right? I have two daughters, they're 13 and 19, and now I have to ask when they're talking to me about a problem, I have to ask is, am I listening or am I solving?
Right.
Right.
Great
Because,
question.
because in some cases they don't want a solution, and if I start trying to solve the problem, they just get more angry at me. I just say, I mean, listen or solve it, and I use it with my wife as well, because sometimes people just want to get it out because it helps them, and then other times they want a solution, right? So you know, it's definitely something that you have to take that pause and remove your own biases and stuff like that, right? So yeah. So what is the last question I'm going to ask is, what is one thing you hope people say about your leadership when you retire, if you retire?
Oh, yeah. I like the when. I like the when framing better. I think, that's a really tough one. I think, I mean, all the words around collaboration and relational come to me, but to be honest, I would like them to comment on a trait, and that would be being present. And it might sound trite, but I actually think that's the most important thing you can do as a leader. When you're sitting in front of somebody, you're actually with them. You're listening to them. You're looking at their body language. You're trying to understand their pain or their harm or the perspective that they're coming from. That doesn't just take time, Kevin. That takes a humility and a vulnerability. And that's something that I really try to show in my leadership. Like when we get something right, we get something right. And when we don't, no matter what I thought I was coming into, I have to listen and be ready to pivot to a different frame, what that person in front of me needs or what that system in that moment needs, right? So I think back to the Ontario Health Team just as an example. In 2019, we were one of the first cohort OHTs to be approved in Cambridge North Dumfries OHT, and I had a LIN position at the time, which turned to an Ontario Health position. My idea of what I was going to do there changed, obviously, in February, March 2020. And so that's okay. And that required obviously all the relationships I spoke to, but the idea of being really open and really actively listening, and that's not just listening to the person in front of us, but looking at the signal. Is this the right time for this conversation, or do we have to have another type of conversation? And I hope being present is something people remember in their interactions with me. I think that would be a great compliment.
Yeah, awesome. I think And I think that's great for even for clinical care, right? Is,
Mm,
physicians are so busy, they see so many patients per day that being present for the patients as you see them and as you care for them is paramount. So, Dr. Mal, thank you for joining me on Physicians Who Lead. I really appreciate your honesty, your leadership. I appreciate your stories and all the work you've done for your fellow physicians and patients and Ontarians in general. Thanks to everybody listening. We will have recorded this several weeks before it gets published. So thanks for listening to this conversation after it's happened, and share it with a colleague, and feel free to reach out and ask any questions. So I'm Kevin Kirkpatrick, and this is the Physicians Who Lead podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.